Oh, what a Sunday it was when you hear Backpack Jones, you get excited because we got starts and sits here on NFL Fantasy Live with Michael F. Florio. When we start, as we customarily do in this position, Mike, with the quarterbacks, who are we putting in our lineups?
Dak Prescott. You talk all the time about how Dak is just airing the ball out right now, and if he's ever going to air it out, this is the week. Not only is he currently averaging the second most passing yards per game and has multiple passing touchdowns in each of his last three, the Cowboys on a regular week are in the top 5 in throw percentage, but right now, they get the Lions, who've allowed a top 8 fantasy quarterback in 2 of their last 3 games. They really are elite at stopping the run, but struggle against the pass. And Detroit has a pretty good offense of their own, which will put up points, which will likely have Dak really needing to keep his foot on the pedal all game. And then I think in London, you start Caleb Williams this week. He is coming off of his best game as a pro, but this is largely about the matchup. The Jaguars have allowed the most fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, which includes the second most passing yards and third most touchdowns. They have allowed a top 8 fantasy quarterback in 4 of their 5 games, and the one game they didn't, that guy still finished top 12. So, yeah, it is a good week to try to go for an upside shot on Caleb Williams. Plus, you know you're going to be watching this early Sunday morning.
Yeah, got to start the day with some football. It'll be fun to get some points in a high-scoring game in London for once. Let's look over at who we're putting on the bench, Mike.
It's one people might not love, but I think it's a week to try to get away from Jared Goff because the Cowboys defense has really struggled against the run, which we know is a strength of the Lions offense, but they've been stingy against the pass. They've allowed just 1 quarterback to top 250 yards against them. Only 2 quarterbacks have thrown multiple passing touchdowns in 5 games against them. And Jared Goff, he only has topped 15 fantasy points once. It was that game where he had a perfect game and caught a touchdown. I'm not banking on that each week. It's not a must sit, but I have Goff on a lot of teams. I paired him with other quarterbacks like Jordan Love, Dak Prescott, Jaden Daniels, Justin Fields. I'm starting all of those guys over Goff this week.
Yeah, what a run. What a run it was. We're going to be coming up in a month since Jared Goff had an incompletion, not that long, but it feels like that. Let's go over to the running back position. Who we're putting in our lineup?
We are getting DeAndre Swift into our starting lineup because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. 25 fantasy points per game in his last 2 games, but what I care about is the volume. 2 weeks ago, he led the Bears in every category: rushing yards, carries, targets, receiving yards, all of that. Last week, he had 22 opportunities as well, and now the Jags are just a great matchup. They've allowed the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs, and they are in the top 3 in catches, yards, and receiving yards allowed to the position. And then give me Chase Brown this week. I think this is a huge week for the Bengals' number 2 running back. He has had more volume each of the last 2 weeks, and it's led to him topping 16 fantasy points in each of his games. Not only did he have the best game any running back has had this season against the Ravens, he is the only running back to have an explosive run against them, and he had 2 of them. That's going to come into play this week because the Giants have allowed explosive runs at the 3rd highest rate. They also struggle against pass-catching backs. Zach Moss is banged up, not practicing on Wednesday. So I think that not only do I think this is a Chase Brown week, my hot take this week is he could be a top 5 fantasy running back.
And it's kind of, you kind of wonder what the offenses look like if it's all Chase Brown, how things might look for your fantasy
all
team.
gas, no break.
As well. I'm looking ahead here. I'm shocked at who you're putting on the bench, Mike.
I literally traded for this player today in a league, but for just this week, if you have another option, you can go ahead and get away from Brian Robinson Jr. because of the matchup. The Ravens have allowed the fewest rushing yards of any team that has played 5 games. They are allowing less than 3 yards per carry, the fewest explosive runs, and just 3 rushing touchdowns all year. Now that matters because 40% of Robinson's fantasy points this year have come off of touchdowns. He's dealing with a knee issue that they really limited his touches last week. I think this could be a week potentially where Austin Eckler outscores Brian Robinson. But again, not a must-sit. You need to have a solid option if you're going to get away from it.
Yes, it's very key. It depends on your circumstance. That's what we have to put into every start and sit. But sometimes you have a circumstance that makes you need some sleepers, Marcus.
Sometimes you got to swing for the fences, right? You can't win by hitting singles. Sometimes you got to hit extra base hits. And to do that, you got to get with some sleepers. So if you're looking for a quarterback that maybe is a little bit under the radar, how about one Daniel Jones? Mr. 10-cent piece himself had a big game last week against the Seattle Seahawks without Malik Neighbors. He was getting it done with Darius Slayton and Wan'Dale Robinson. But you look back, he's got 3 games this season with 2 touchdown passes and no interceptions, 3 straight games with at least 230 passing yards, which maybe doesn't sound like a whole lot, but in this new era of guys not throwing for a ton of yards, it's a pretty notable stat. Facing a Cincinnati defense that in its last 3 games given up 274 passing yards per game with 8 touchdowns and 1 interception. Keep an eye on Malik Neighbors, still going through concussion protocol. We'll see if he's available this week. If so, that's just one more weapon for Daniel Jones to throw the football to. Next up, Tyler Algier. I know he's not getting a ton of opportunity, but still averaging 8 touches per game, 5.6 yards per touch. The route participation for Algier has jumped dramatically over the past couple of weeks, so now starting to get involved in a passing game that looks like it's coming to life for Atlanta. 7 different running backs have had top 20 weekly finishes against this Carolina Panthers defense, including Rashawn Johnson, who last week scored a pair of touchdowns on very limited opportunities. We know that it's not a huge role for Algier behind Bijan Robinson, but he's got a steady role, steady number of touches, and in a game where Atlanta could move the ball frequently, he could have some fantasy production. Now, if you're looking for a deep sleeper, how about we go Tyjae Spears down there in Tennessee? Now, sort of like Algier, kind of a limited number of opportunities, although head coach Brian Callahan has said repeatedly they would like to get Spears more involved in the offense. Had a season-high 17 touches against the Miami Dolphins in Week 4, going against an Indianapolis defense that we have been picking on, whether it's through the air or on the ground. They've given up the 4th most rushing yards, 5th most receiving yards to running backs. Knowing that Spears and Tony Pollard do similar things, if he gets enough opportunity, could pop a big play and end up being a nice flex option for deeper league players.
Oh, an amazing run from Lamar Jackson and pass as we get to an amazing opportunity to get the right players in your lineup for more starts and sits. We did the quarterbacks and the running backs. Let's get the wide receivers. Who we start?
You're going to like this one.
Okay.
From your Baltimore Ravens.
Okay.
Zay Flowers. He is the winner of Who Faces the Commanders this week at wide receiver. Plus, you see there, he leads the Ravens in pretty much every receiving category. The Commanders, not only have they allowed the most touchdowns to wide receivers, but they've allowed the 7th most fantasy points. A wide receiver has scored at least 20 fantasy points in all but one game this year against Washington. And in that one game, the wide receiver scored 18. So with Flowers coming off of a huge game, one of the best games in his young career, I think you continue to start him in what could be a high-scoring game. But do not call me biased in the battle of the Beltway, because I think you start Scary Terry McLaurin in this one as well. He is a very healthy 27% target share right now. He's averaging over 17 fantasy points per game in his last 3. And then the Ravens might seem like a scary matchup, and if you are a running back, they are. But they've allowed the 3rd most yards and 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this week. Plus, I just think it's going to be a high-scoring game with the Commanders' offense doing what it's doing. Lamar's on the other side, so I want pieces of this game in my fantasy line.
Yeah, we're not celebrating the successes of either defense, even though Washington has gotten better. That's because they were really, really bad at the start of the season. You've got a really good wide receiver that's going on your bench this week, Mike.
Yeah, coming off his best game of the year, too. I know a lot of people were like, Garrett Wilson went off last week. I see it as he needed 22 targets to reach 100 yards. I do not love that. Plus, the strength of the Bills' defense is at cornerback. It's something that I talk about a lot here. Because of that, tight ends and running backs have eaten against this defenses, but receivers really have not. They've allowed the 4th fewest passing yards and 5th fewest fantasy points per game to wide receivers this year. And I know different quarterback, but in 2 games against the Bills last year, Garrett Wilson was held to just 43 yards, and he averages less than 12 fantasy points per game in his career against them. Plus, you can fire the head coach. It's not going to change anything on the offensive side of the ball. So if you have another option, I think you get away and you take it.
Yeah, maybe stay tuned to see if there's any news coming out of Florham Park about any particular change, any reason to believe that things will be different on offense. Let's go over to some tight ends. What are we talking about here, Mike?
No shock.
Oh, okay.
We're starting Kyle Pitts
Let's
again.
do it.
I know we had him as a sit last week. Even our producers are getting sick of me telling you to start Kyle Pitts right now. But last week, Cam Wolfe came out before the game and reported that the Falcons want to get him the ball more. And then he went out, had 8 targets and his second best fantasy game in the last 3 seasons. I know they're not going to throw like that every week and the floor is low, but he clearly brings upside, which is enough to keep starting him at a weak tight end position, especially since the Panthers have allowed the 6th most fantasy points per game to tight ends. And shout out to Cam Wolfe, except for his baseball team. And then I'm starting Tucker Kraft. Because why would you not right now? He has been the tight end 1 in each of the last 2 weeks. He has 14 targets in that span, and he is the 2nd most yards amongst the position in that span. The upside is entirely too high, in my opinion. The Cardinals just allowed a huge game to George Kittle, and as I spoke about earlier in the show, I just have a feeling this could be a high-scoring game with 2 good offenses and not 2 of the best defenses in the NFL.
Let's go over to the folks who kind of punted on the tight end position, and they're trying to figure out, who do I not start? Who do I not pick up off the wire? Where are you going there?
This is one that you might not love.
Oh.
I think you get away from the Ravens tight ends again this week. I know last week, both of them, I know last week was a step in the right direction, but Mark Andrews was still held to just 16 routes in a game where Lamar threw 42 times. He played just over half of the snaps. Likely had those 2 touchdowns, which was awesome. But he had just 3 targets and 13 yards. So if he doesn't catch the 2 touchdowns, we're talking about him finishing with single-digit fantasy points. Plus, Commanders, 5th fewest fantasy points per game to tight ends, and they have not allowed a top 10 tight end yet this season. So if you can get away from the Ravens duo, I would suggest you do so this week.
Charlie Kolar somewhere I just want to mention, like,
he outproduced both of them.
If I could get a sit, that would be great. So those are your starts and sits at the wide receiver and tight end position, but we need more sleepers, Marcus.
Yes, we do. We're going to look at some wide receivers and tight ends here, and you might sense a theme with some of the games we keep talking about. You know, I mentioned Kirk Cousins and Drake London and Tyler Algier. Let's just keep the Falcons love going, because Ray McCloud, yes, I said it, Ray McCloud has sleeper value. Yeah, look, we know at this point to start Drake London. We pretty much know to start Darnell Mooney. But you know what? Ray McCloud is actually 3rd on this team in routes run. He has an 85% snap share. He has as much of this Falcons passing game as any of those other guys that we mentioned previously. 4 games with 5 or more targets, and we know how Carolina has been very vulnerable to wide receivers. 7 receiving touchdowns allowed to the position this year. Another game we seem to talk a whole lot about so far is this battle of the Beltway between the Commanders and the Ravens. And Zach Ertz, look, the old guy, very quietly getting it done. I know it's not flashy, but you look at Ertz, 2nd to Terry McLaurin in routes, targets, receptions, and receiving yards, going against a Baltimore defense that has been very tight end friendly. The 4th most fantasy points allowed to the position, 2nd most receptions, 2nd most receiving yards. So if maybe they're locking down on some of those guys downfield, Jaden Daniels looks a little bit shorter and gets it to his veteran tight end. And let's go on the other side of that same game for maybe a deeper sleeper. That's going to be Rashad Bateman. You heard Florio talking about Zay Flowers and the opportunity that he will have. Bateman's actually been more active in this passing game than you probably realize. 2nd most routes, 2nd most targets. He's got 2 receiving touchdowns in the last 3 games. This could be a high-scoring affair and another pass-heavy game script. I don't know if they have Lamar throwing it 40-plus times this week, but still could be a very pass-heavy game, which means if the tight ends are going to struggle, that means potentially more opportunities for Rashad Bateman. More opportunities for you to keep watching us here on NFL Fantasy Live. We are going to come drop some bars about some guys that maybe we've had it up to here with. Listen to us get all poetic and stuff and offer a little bit of justice coming up on NFL Fantasy Live.